Good evening. This is Forum Daily for Friday, December 27th. I'm Julie Stetland, filling in for Teresa Skubik. Indian law enforcement agencies have accused the Canadian government of widespread trafficking of international students through Canada to the U.S. India's Enforcement Directorate said this week that a multi-city search has revealed incriminating evidence of human trafficking and alleged links between dozens of Canadian colleges and two entities in Mumbai accused of illegally ferrying students across the Canada-US border. Indian officials say that they started to investigate after a family of four were found frozen to death in January 2022 outside Emerson, Manitoba, near the U.S. border. A jury found two men guilty at their Minnesota trial last month on charges related to bringing unauthorized people into the U.S., transporting them, and profiting from it. Immigration measures announced as part of Canada's border response to incoming U.S. President Donald Trump's 25% tariff threat are starting to be implemented. It's beginning with a ban on what's known as flag polling. That's when someone who was in Canada on a temporary visa leaves for the U.S., then quickly re enters Canada to access immigration services at a port of entry. The restriction on providing work and study permits to flag pollers took effect on Tuesday. Germany is headed for a national election 7 months early. President Frank-Walter Steinmeier ordered the parliament dissolved today and set new elections for February 23rd. Mr. Steinmeier made his decision after Chancellor Olaf Scholz's governing coalition collapsed when he lost a confidence vote last week. The election campaign is already underway, with the Conservative Opposition Union Party leading in the polls. French President Emmanuel Macron's office announced a new government Monday after the previous cabinet collapsed in a historic vote prompted by fighting over the country's budget. Newly named Prime Minister Francois Bayrou put together the government that includes members of the outgoing conservative-dominated team and some new figures from centrist or left-leaning backgrounds. Coming up with a 2025 budget will be the most urgent order of business. The new government enters office after months of political deadlock and pressure from financial markets to reduce France's colossal debt. Ukraine's military intelligence agency, GUR, suggests that North Korean troops are suffering heavy losses while fighting in the Russian region of Kursk. GUR says that Ukrainian strikes left North Korean military units with heavy casualties, noting that they are also dealing with supply issues and drinking water shortages. Earlier this week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that some 3,000 North Korean troops have been killed or injured in the Kursk region. Kyiv announced several weeks ago that North Korea had sent between 10 and 12,000 troops to Russia to help in the ongoing war. A lawmaker in Azerbaijan is blaming Moscow for a plane crash in Kazakhstan that killed 38 people. While authorities in all three countries were tight-lipped about a possible cause, an official told Turan news agency that the plane was fired on while in the skies over Krasny and urged Russia to offer an official apology. 29 people survived Wednesday's crash, which happened when an Azerbaijan Airlines flight en route from Baku to the Russian city of Krasny tried to make an emergency landing in Kazakhstan for reasons still unknown. Houthi rebels in Yemen fired a missile at Israel early Friday, hours after a wave of Israeli airstrikes hit Yemen's main airport in Sana'a as the World Health Organization's Director General was about to board a flight there. 3 people were killed and dozens were wounded in the Israeli airstrikes, including a member of the UN plane's crew who underwent surgery. The Israeli military later said it wasn't aware that the WHO chief was at the location in Yemen and that it attacked infrastructure used by Yemen's Houthi rebels at the airport. Israel's attorney general has ordered police to open an investigation into Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's wife on suspicion of harassing political opponents and witnesses in the Israeli leader's corruption trial. The investigation would focus on the findings of a recent report by the UVDA investigative program into Sarah Netanyahu. The program uncovered a trove of WhatsApp messages in which she appears to instruct a former aide to organize protests against political opponents and to intimidate a key witness in the trial. We'll be right back.
Despite the fact that 2024 was an eventful year, both in Ottawa and around the world, food policy in Canada remained a top headline grabber from January to December. Food prices are still inflated, food bank visits are now up to shocking levels, and food distribution suffered setbacks due to labor disputes at ports and railways. These top headlines don't even include the potential impact of Donald Trump's proposed tariffs, and of course, there is a growing debate over the carbon tax and its impact on food prices. Joining me now to discuss these top headlines is Dr. Sylvain Charbois from Dalhousie University's Agri-Foods Analytics Lab. Sylvain, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So your top story, you published on this, food bank usage hitting what feels like record numbers. Can you give us the lay of the land in terms of just how dependent Canadians are now on food banks?
Yeah, how can it not be the number one food story of the year? So every year we actually do our top 10, but this year it wasn't hard to pick that one issue. Food bank usage is high. It's at a record high this year. We estimate that over 2 million Canadians actually visit food banks every month right now, and the food insecurity level is at 23.9%, which is almost 10% more than in the US. So something is really going wrong right now in Canada, and you just go to a food bank and see how busy they are. The working poor is also a big segment of the population right now. A lot of people do have jobs, even 2, 3 jobs, and they still have to go to food banks to make ends meet. So obviously, a lot of people are being left behind.
Yeah, you mentioned working poor. Is that a newer phenomenon, or is that part of the reason for the increase? Because, I mean, when we see these food banks talk about the holiday influx, I know there have been several instances where we're not just talking about people who are maybe unemployed or underemployed. In many instances, we're talking about people who are fully employed.
No, absolutely. It's not a new phenomena, but the phenomena is growing. And so we know that like almost a third of people who go to food banks are people who are working, would have a job or 2 or 3, and so that phenomena is really growing. That made things obvious. I think really the big problem is the cost of living issue. With interest rates much higher than before, it really caught a lot of people off guard, especially people in the middle class.
And on that note of cost of living, one of the debates that you've been right in the middle of is the carbon tax and its impact on food. What is your view in terms of how carbon pricing impacts the food system?
I think, and I've actually testified before Parliament a few times about this, and at Senate also once, to argue that I think we're getting this all wrong. The fascination around retail prices is the wrong focus. I think we should look at competitiveness, the agri-food sector's competitiveness, and that's where we're starting to see some wheels falling off, essentially. Because if you look at wholesale food prices in Canada versus wholesale food prices in the US, ours have actually gone up 40% more than in the US since 2019, when the federal carbon tax was implemented. So certainly very concerned about competitiveness, which means that grocers will likely be more tempted to actually buy outside of Canada to feed Canadians than actually buying food that was grown and produced right here in Canada. And that can lead to more food insecurity down the road, and food affordability will eventually be impacted. But for now, most of the studies that I've seen looking at retail prices or correlating retail prices, food retail prices, with the carbon tax, are measuring something that can't be measured at all, because a lot
Hmm.
of things can actually impact retail prices: the weather, consumer behavior,
Sure.
loss leading, promotions. Lots of things can actually impact retail prices.
Yeah, there are definitely other market dynamics that play into it, but I'm curious for the people who've been critical of you, we only have about 30 seconds here and we'll pick it up when we come back. But if carbon pricing isn't inflating the production process, then one could come to the conclusion that it's not working to reduce emissions. Is that an accurate assumption?
We're not even trying to measure how the carbon tax is impacting the environment. And Minister Guilbeault himself actually admitted it. And that's a huge
Hmm.
blind spot for the policy.
All right, Sylvain, we're going to go to break quickly here, but we will come right back. We're going to look at a couple more of these big stories, including Ozempic and its impact on the food supply. We'll be right back. We're back with Sylvain Charbois from Dalhousie University's Agri-Food Analytics Lab. Sylvain, before the break, I mentioned Ozempic and GLP-1 drugs. You have this in your top 10 food stories for the year. Obviously, we've covered this pretty extensively in terms of the health side of it,
Yeah.
but walk us through what the potential impact could be in terms of what Canadians eat, what they're looking for in the marketplace. How is this changing the market for food?
Yeah, so well, I mean, 2024 was a year when Oprah Winfrey resigned from the Weight Watchers board of directors, and it came as a shock, because she was admitting that she was using a GLP-1 drug to lose weight. And if you have seen Oprah Winfrey of late, she's obviously lost a lot of weight. And I think it got a lot of politicians, industry, to think differently about the market. And we actually did release a study on GLP-1s earlier this year, and we were contacted by a few uh, major food players, and I must say, a lot of food companies are concerned, because if you have, say, 30-35 million people on GLP-1s, and all of a sudden they don't impulse consume, they don't
Hmm.
impulse buy, they don't drink alcohol as much. I mean, it changes the dynamic at the grocery store, in restaurants, at the liquor store, everything really. And so I think over the next several years, you'll see a food industry trying to really understand exactly what it means to service a market with so many people using this type of medication. In fact, we've seen one company releasing a Ozempic friendly product, or
Okay.
Ozempic friendly products, over the last several months. So it's just the beginning, really.
What is it? What is an Ozempic friendly product?
Because I mean, a lot of people, when they eat too much sugar or sodium, they actually feel ill. And so
Yep.
I suspect that it's comforting to know that a company may have thought about some of these
Okay.
people. It's
Yep.
like the gluten-free phenomena, but
Yep.
I do think we're going to see more of these products in the future.
Okay. Um, GST holiday. That was announced. It took a while to go through.
Yeah.
There have been some murmurs that restaurants are appreciating it right now. What is the
Oh, they are
impact?
absolutely.
What's the impact here? How do you see this playing out over the next month and a half in terms of the impact this is going to have on the food industry, the restaurant industry?
Yeah, I think, well, when you look at the food industry in particular, I think there'll be a shift from retail to service, probably
Hmm.
over the next couple of months, because savings are much more interesting at the restaurant. In Ontario, for example, it's a minus 13%. In
Yeah.
New Brunswick, it's minus 15. Nova Scotia minus 14. So savings are pretty substantial. At the grocery store, very few products are taxed.
Yeah.
Really, the ready to eat products, snacks, and things like that. But the bottom line is that it really has created a lot of chaos in the industry. Companies like PepsiCo Canada decided to boycott the new law, essentially saying that it will continue to charge GST to its clients like Loblaw and Sobeys. So they're getting the squeeze.
And
And of course, in a
is the
grocery
reason
store, you
for
got
that? Is the reason for that just that it's too complicated to go through all the SKUs and reconfigure the system, or is there something else at play here?
I think well, that's what's being claimed. My guess is that Canada is just not that important for a
Okay.
multinational. I mean, why bother spending all that money just to accommodate a small market for 2 months, the busiest months of the year, by the way?
Yeah. Okay. Food recalls. We've had you on our program here, Forum Daily, as the food recalls have been announced for the year over the year. Are we seeing an uptick in food recalls, and should we be concerned? We have about a minute before we have to go to break.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of in terms of food recalls, 2024 will be year number 3 in terms of the record number of food recalls. So it's not a record year, but close.
Hmm.
And I think really some of the recalls that impacted high volume food categories like bakery, for example, cantaloupes as well.
Yep.
So that's probably why we heard a lot more about food recalls in general.
Is there anything different in the food supply now, or is this just where we have a better pulse on catching these problems as they arise?
I just think that media is doing its job. I mean,
Okay.
in terms of risk communication, we're highly reliant on risk communication, and frankly, I was shocked, surprisingly shocked, that media still had some capacity
Yeah.
to inform the public about some of these food recalls.
Well, Sylvain, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back.
As we enter the new year, Canada's Chief Public Health Officer is closely monitoring a resurgence of measles in the country. Dr. Teresa Tam says there were far more measles cases in Canada in 2024 than in previous years. Dr. Tam also said that bird flu is among her top concerns going into 2025. The country's only confirmed human case of H5N1 is from a teen in BC who became severely ill in November. An Oregon based pet food company is voluntarily recalling a product sold in British Columbia and 12 American states after an indoor cat in Oregon died from eating frozen cat food that tested positive for bird flu. Northwest Naturals in Portland says it's recalling one batch of its 2-pound feline turkey recipe, raw frozen pet food. Consumers are urged to check their products with best if used by dates between May 21st, 2026 and June 23rd, 2026. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation has released its Naughty and Nice list for 2024. The list features those who were naughty or wasted taxpayer dollars and those who were nice and exercised fiscal responsibility or advocated for Canadian taxpayers. The naughty list included the Prime Minister, Global Affairs Canada, the CEO and President of the CBC, and Premier Doug Ford. And the nice list included the PBO, Premier Scott Moe, and Premier Daniel Smith. We were joined by Jay Goldberg, Ontario Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, to discuss who made it onto the list and why.
Heading up the naughty list this year was CBC President Catherine Tate. The reason that she is heading up the naughty list is because she gave out $18 million in bonuses to CBC executives, and her term as CBC president is ending very shortly. And she's not ruling out taking severance pay, despite the fact that her salary is about $500,000 a year. Some of the other people on the naughty list included Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for raising the carbon tax, among other things. Premier Doug Ford of Ontario was on there. He was on there because he extended political welfare by 2 years. These are payments that go to political parties out of taxpayers' pockets. They were supposed to end at the end of this year, but he snuck through an extension for 2 years, so he ended up on the naughty list. And then we added, of course, Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew on the day the list came out, because he announced that gas taxes were coming back in Manitoba. Of course, as well on the naughty list was Global Affairs Canada. Global Affairs Canada, we found out through three information requests, is billing over $50,000 a month to taxpayers, alcohol expenses. So this is not something that, for example, those who are working for Global Affairs are paying for out of pocket, as it is the case in many cases with government employees. But in this case, this is booze that was expensed to taxpayers for hosting various events and such. So that's over $50,000 a month hitting taxpayers out of global affairs. One really interesting small one actually was in Prince Edward Island. The former mayor of Kensington resigned his position because he was not willing to approve of council's decision to use taxpayer dollars to build yet another pickleball court in the city. There had already been a few, and he wasn't willing to spend almost $30,000 to add another one. He got on there. The parliamentary budget officer got on there for holding the government accountable, and in particular, releasing data that shows that the carbon tax costs Canadians more than they get back in rebates. They gave us that information, so we have that because of the PBO. And then there's a few premiers who got on that list. Scott Moe for taking provincial action to take the carbon tax off of home heating. Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Andrew Furey was on the list for extending his gas tax cut throughout the entire year. And Alberta Premier Danielle Smith for going to court in order to try to challenge the constitutionality of the carbon tax because of the Trudeau carve-outs for Atlantic Canada.
Canada beat Finland 4-0 in its opening game at the World Junior Hockey Championship in Ottawa. Gavin McKenna, Easton Cohen, Luca Benelli, and Matthew Schaefer all scored for Canada, while Carter George made 31 saves. The Canadians are looking to improve on a disastrous fifth-place finish at last year's tournament in Sweden. Swimmer Summer McIntosh says it's pretty incredible to be honored with the Canadian Press Female Athlete of the Year for the second time in a row. The Toronto teenager was the overwhelming choice among sports editors, producers, and reporters across the country. That's all for today. Take care, Canada.